In this video, we'll go over 10 cards that are way too good for their respective archetypes, and rank them in how much better they are than their archetype. And at number 10, we have Ally of Justice Catastor. This card is part of the Ally of Justice archetype, which is probably one of the worst archetypes in the game's history. Although this particular synchro monster is one of the better level 5 synchro monsters in the game, to the point where they still haven't added it to Duel Links because it's a little bit too good. As what this card does is if it battles a non-dark monster, it destroys that monster at the start of the damage step. And with generic materials and a decent attack at 2200, this was the go-to card if you just wanted to selectively destroy your opponent's cards, and could go into level 5 synchros. Although synchro monsters don't get used as much as they used to, and they released a whole bunch of other good level 5 synchro monsters over the years after Ally of Justice, that it kind of only makes this list because it was so much better than the archetype it's part of. And it's a really good starting point to show what this list is kind of about. And at number 9, we have Gagaga Cowboy. This is a rank 4 monster who has 2 effects. One of them allows you to detach an Exceeds material in order to allow this card to gain 1000 attack, and an opponent's monsters to lose 500 attack if it attacks a monster. And if this card is in defense position, you can detach a material to inflict 800 points of burn damage to your opponent. And you can only use one effect per turn. And the main use of this card was to bring it out in defense position to inflict 800 points of damage. And this effect was so good that this card is probably the most played Exceeds monster in the game's history, and codified the term cowboy for game, as if you could just get your opponent to 800 or less life points, you basically won the game, as you could just go into Gagaga Cowboy during your main phase 2 to inflict the burn damage to finish off your opponent. Having your life points under 1000 was a real concern before Master Rule 4, because Gagaga Cowboy existed. And one of the most heavily played rank 4 monsters in the game, which surprisingly still sees lots of play even today, is technically part of the Gagaga archetype. Now, many of you probably don't know what this archetype does, and that's because it's kind of a small one, whose gimmick was around changing their levels of their monsters to be around 1 to 8. And for an archetype all about changing the levels of their monsters, they had 3 rank 4 monsters as their only extra deck support, which was kind of weird that they didn't have them of a whole bunch of different kinds of ranks, but no one really played them anyway, so I guess it didn't matter. And at number 8, we have Raidraptor Ultimate Falcon. Ultimate Falcon is one of the best targets if you have the ability to cheat a monster out of your extra deck, because baseline, it has 3500 attack and is immune to all card effects, and that stat line in effect is good enough to kind of instant win against some decks. So it sees a lot of play alongside cards like Waking the Dragon, which occasionally sees extra deck play in competitive decks. Ultimate Falcon definitely sees a lot more play than the archetype it's part of, the Raidraptors, who were all about dark winged beast monsters that go into Exceeds monsters and then rank them up. As another one of Raidraptor Ultimate Falcon's effects is that if this card has a Raidraptor monster as one of its Exceeds materials, it gains an additional effect where you can reduce the attack of all of your opponent's monsters by 1000 during the end phase. And this card is so rarely brought out properly to actually gain this effect that I kind of forgot what its other effect even was, even though I've talked about this card many times in other top 10 lists. Generally, really good cards will show up a lot in my videos, so I usually have all of their effects and everything about them memorized, except Ultimate Falcon. I always have to look up that second effect because it's never used. Now, the archetype it's part of is not that bad. It has even seen some competitive play in the past, and they recently got a really good Link monster that might allow them to see more play in the future. So this one kind of gets a low spot on this list, because I kind of gauge these cards based on the gap of how good they are in comparison to their archetype. Ultimate Falcon is a good card, but its archetype isn't half bad either. Not top tier, but not half bad. So it doesn't have a big enough gap to make a higher spot on this list, mainly because the other ones are a lot better. And at number 7, we have Isolde, Two Tails of the Noble Knights. This is a Link 2 monster that requires 2 warriors as its materials and has 2 really good effects. The first one is when this card is Link summoned, you can add any 1 warrior monster from your deck to your hand. You just can't use it that turn. Its other effect allows you to send equipped spell cards with different names from your deck to the graveyard to special summon a warrior type monster from your deck who has a level equal to the amount of cards you sent to the graveyard. So if you send 1 equipped spell card, you can special summon a level 1 warrior type monster, and etc, etc. And because of this card, previously unplayed cards like Divine Sword Phoenix Blade started seeing lots of play. And Isolde is one of the best warrior support link monsters in the game, and warrior types are the most plentiful type of monster in the game, so that's actually a pretty big deal. And Isolde is technically part of the Noble Knight archetype, which is an archetype about warrior type monsters who use equipped spell cards, so the effects kind of fit. And Noble Knights have seen a handful of play over the years, and they occasionally get new support. So even though Isolde is a super good link monster that's used in every warrior deck, the archetype it's part of isn't half bad either. Noble Knight decks have topped a lot of events in the past, which is why this card only gets the number 7 spot on this list, but still definitely makes this list because Noble Knights are nowhere near as good as this one link monster is. And at number 6, we have Dinowrestler Pankratops. This card has 2 effects. The first one allows it to special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls more monsters than you do. And with it being a level 7 monster with 2600 attack, this is a super good effect for this card to have for its stat line. Its other effect allows it to tribute a Dinowrestler monster to destroy 1 card on the field. And since this effect is a quick effect, meaning it can be used during either player's turn whenever you want, gives this card disruption during your opponent's turn, or an out to your opponent trying to selectively pick this card off. Spell speed 2 destruction effects are super good, and generally only attached to really powerful cards that eventually get banned or limited, which was the case with this card, which is currently limited to 1 copy per deck. Because both of its effects are super good, being able to bring itself out easily and selectively destroy any 1 card on a quick effect means this card saw tons of competitive play in all kinds of decks, to the point where they had to limit it because it was too good and was seeing too much play, which cannot be said about the archetype it's part of, which sees no play at all. And I'm sure most people don't even know how Dinowrestlers work. Well, I actually didn't know how they worked either, so I had to look it up. Apparently, they're all about the battle phase and have effects that can only be activated when your opponent controls more monsters than you. And since they're all dinosaur type monsters, there's no real reason to play them over the much better generic dinosaur support cards, which is why I assume they don't see very much play, and why Pankratops is a staple card in normal dinosaur decks as well. Although he's just a pretty good staple card in pretty much any deck, to be honest. And at number 5, we have Heavymetalfoes Electrumite. This is a Link 2 Pendulum support link monster who has 3 effects that basically allow you to go +1 in card advantage while setting up your extra deck with choice pendulum monsters. As when this card is link summoned, you can put a pendulum monster from your deck into your extra deck face up. It can also selectively destroy one of your face up cards in order to add a pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. And if a card in your pendulum zone leaves the field, you get to draw 1 card. All 3 of these effects are good in pretty much all pendulum decks, as all pendulum decks like to put pendulum monsters into their extra deck face up, they like to add those cards back to their hand, and they like to destroy their own cards, including their own scales. And they like to draw cards on their pendulum monsters leaving the pendulum zone. And this card is currently banned for being a little bit too good at supporting all pendulum monsters. And this card is part of the Metalfoes archetype, which is a pendulum archetype that has a lot of neural monsters in it who all have effects that relate to destroying your cards and gaining advantage off of that, as well as going into fusion monsters. And the Metalfoes archetype did see competitive play in the past, because the pendulum monsters could destroy other cards they controlled instead of their own scales, which just combos very well with a lot of decks that like to destroy their own cards. But they kind of stopped seeing play after Master Rule 4, which heavily nerfed pretty much all pendulum decks, including Metalfoes, and Heavymetalfoes was supposed to be a very good link monster to kind of help pendulum decks, with how heavily restricted they were with the new format, and did such a good job that it worked better in non-Metalfoes decks, so they just kinda stopped seeing play, while Magician and Endymion decks were basically the go-to pendulum decks of the link format. And at number 4, we have Magician Souls. This is a Dark Magician support card, which has a hand effect to send a level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster from your deck to the graveyard as a cost, which then allows you to activate one of 2 of its effects, where it can either special summon itself, or send itself to the graveyard to special summon a Dark Magician monster from your graveyard. It also has another effect on the field where you can send up to 2 spell or trap cards from your hand or field to the graveyard to draw that many cards. Now, this card was obviously meant as Dark Magician support, but since it works on any level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster, it sees play in all kinds of different competitive meta decks, since there's a couple of good targets to send to the graveyard with this card. like how Spiral decks can send Spiral Master Plan to the graveyard in order to use it to great benefit. Other decks like to use Apprentice Illusion Magician with Magician Souls as an engine, since the card can special summon itself by discarding one card, which activates danger effects. The card is so good in other decks because of its ability to special summon itself and also trade in some of your Speller Traps for extra draws. It's an engine kind of like Brilliant Fusion, except the Garnet of the Magician Souls engine is also useful for combo plays on its own. And since technically this card was created for the Dark Magician archetype, and it has allowed Dark Magician decks to see some competitive success, it is just definitely used much more often in all kinds of other decks instead, and has very much overshadowed the deck it's originally part of. And at number 3, we have Lavalval Chain. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster with generic materials who has the effect to once per turn send one card from your deck to the graveyard. Or you can choose a monster from your deck and place it on top of your deck. And the reason this card is currently banned is for the effect of sending any one card from your deck to the graveyard, as that's an incredibly good effect for a wide range of decks, especially when you can gain that effect with any 2 level 4 monsters, as there is currently a wide range of cards restricted on the ban list that have effects to send specific types of cards from your deck to the graveyard. And Lavalval Chain allows you to send any spell, trap, or monster card. It is the main combo piece in all kinds of OTK and FTK strategies, a place that is currently taken up by Curious, the Lightsworn Dominion, who has the same effect of sending a card from your deck to the graveyard, but is a little bit harder to bring out, as it requires 3 monsters of the same attributes but different types as its materials. Now, the Lavalval archetype itself is all about effects that activate in the graveyard, while having a certain number of Lavalval monsters in your graveyard first, before you can use those effects. So, this card's effect does make sense within its archetype, of selectively sending those cards to the graveyard. And Lavalval decks even saw some competitive playing in Duel Links when they first came out. They don't really see play in normal Yu-Gi-Oh though, except for this one lone card, which is just very good generic support for a wide range of different archetypes and strategies. And at number 2, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. This card is in the top 50 of the most played cards in the game, as it appears very frequently in the side decks of competitive decks, because what it does is it allows you to tribute summon this card to your opponent's side of the field by tributing 3 of their monsters. And since getting rid of 3 of your opponent's monsters for this card's summon counts as just a normal summoning condition and not an effect, your opponent can't actually play around this. And very few cards are immune to this card's form of removal. So since your opponent can't really negate the summon, and since it's a normal summon for you, this is one of the best ways to break an opponent's unbreakable board of negates, indestructible monsters, or floodgates, and to get rid of 3 of them at once at that. And all you lose in that exchange is just 1 card from your hand and your normal summon for the turn, which is a pretty good price to pay for getting rid of cards your opponent probably put a ton of resources into, and can sometimes just win you the game on its own. Now, this card does have other effects. It can also tribute itself to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, and setting its attack and defense to 4,000. And this card is technically part of the God card archetype, which is an incredibly small archetype notable for being the only cards in the game with the Divine Beast types in the Divine attribute, which this card shares. And the God cards are not very good, and the only one that did see competitive play was definitely not the Winged Dragon of Ra. Although since this one card does see so much play in so many different kinds of decks, Sphere Mode is technically the most used God card in the game, and this one definitely deserves a high spot on this list, for being such an incredibly useful card in comparison to the archetype it comes from, which isn't very competitive at all. However, I think the number 1 spot on this list just barely beats out Sphere Mode because its gap is much higher. And at number 1, we have Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. This is a synchro monster which was banned for 2 years, and basically always saw play whenever it wasn't banned. Trishula has the effect that when it's synchro summoned, you can banish 3 cards from your opponent. 1 random one from their hand, 1 from their field, and 1 from their graveyard. Now, the thing to note about this card's effect, it's not once per turn, and it doesn't target. So you can selectively get rid of cards on your opponent's side of the field, and they can't actually respond to it with something like Pankratops, tributing itself in order to avoid getting destroyed by targeted effects, since you can just choose something else after it gets rid of itself. Now, this card is supposed to be bounced around the fact that it's difficult to synchro summon, as it's a level 9 monster that requires at least 3 materials, 1 tuner and 2 or more non-tuners. But being able to get rid of 3 cards on its summon is definitely worth that cost, especially since you can use cards like Desynchro in order to send it back to the extra deck to get your synchro materials back in order to just go into it again and use its effect for a second time. There are currently 2 other monsters in the game who were created directly based off of Trishula, called Necrons of Trishula and Trishula the Dragon of Icy Imprisonment, both of which have similar effects of banishing 3 cards, and both of them have hard once per turns on their effects. So there's no way to abuse it to use their effects multiple times like you can with the original Trishula. Because its effect was just that strong, they made sure to put limitations on its retrains. And once the new Master Rule revisions come through, and synchro monsters are easier to bring out than they are now, you can expect Trishula to probably be put on the ban list again in some way. Because as it is now in Master Rule 4, it still sees consistent play, and the archetype Trishula is part of, the Ice Barriers, is another one of those incredibly terrible and mediocre archetypes like the Ally of Justice. The Ice Barriers are not at all good at bringing out Trishula, despite the fact that it was made for them. And the Ice Barriers kind of have a long-running tradition of having very mediocre main deck monsters, while having some of the best synchro monsters in the game, as 2 of the other Ice Barriers synchro monsters also appeared on the ban list, with one of them getting an errata to its effect before it was removed from being banned. And even the 4th and final Ice Barrier synchro monster is pretty good. So with 3 of the 4 synchro monsters appearing on the banned list, it's almost comical that none of the other Ice Barrier main deck monsters are even close to as good as their synchros, which is why there is such a huge gap between Trishula being super good, to the point where it may get banned again in the future, in comparison to the archetype it's technically supposed to be part of. Which is why I think Trishula is the perfect example of what this list is supposed to be about, and just barely takes the number 1 spot, since I think the Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere mode is also a hot contender for this spot. Alright, and that's the list. This video idea has actually been requested quite a few times over the years, so if you know of any other videos that I should make that are also highly requested, make sure to let me know down in the comments. And if you like this video, you'll probably like the playlist of all the other top 10s on this channel, which all have the same level of quality as this one, and the playlist is at over 100 videos now, which is the perfect thing to put on the background while you're doing other things or playing video games, which will be linked at the end of this video in an end card.